Welcome to Part 2 of Murder on Broadway. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 6. Call for Help. Tuesday, June 11, 11 a.m. From the moment he stepped into the room, Harley made a strong impression. He was a serious man in his early 30s, ruggedly built, and there was a squared-off nature to his shoulders that hinted at military training. He walked with a noticeable limp, his right foot dragged slightly, and I observed that his left arm was twisted into a permanent arc, likely the result of an old injury that had never healed properly. He was quiet and reserved, with steady, intelligent eyes. Stanford immediately gestured toward a wicker chair by the closet door, but Harley declined, opting instead to stand before the district attorney with a soldier's posture of respectful attention. Stanford began the questioning with a few personal inquiries. It soon became clear that Harley had served as a sergeant in World War I, had sustained serious injuries twice, and had returned home just before the armistice. He had been working as a telephone operator for over a year now. His full name was William Elmer Harley, and he had been part of the 308th Infantry of the 77th Division of the Overseas Forces. Now, Harley, Stanford continued, there are details about last night's tragedy that you can provide. Yes, sir. There was no doubt that this former soldier would accurately share anything he knew, and if he were uncertain, he would admit it. He possessed all the traits of a careful and well-trained witness. First of all, what time did you come on duty last night? At 10 o'clock, sir. The straightforwardness of his answer left no room for doubt. It was evident that Harley would arrive on time, no matter the hour. It was my short shift. The day operator and I alternate between long and short shifts. And did you see Miss Simon come in last night after the theatre? Yes, sir. Everyone who comes in has to pass by the switchboard. What time did she arrive? It couldn't have been more than a few minutes after 11. Was she alone? No, sir. There was a gentleman with her. Do you know who he was? I don't know his name, sir, but I've seen him a few times before when he visited Miss Simon. Can you describe him? Yes, sir. He's tall and clean-shaven except for a very short grey mustache, and I'd guess he's about 45. He looks, if you catch my drift, sir, like a man of means and standing. Stanford nodded. And now, tell me, did he go into Miss Simon's apartment with her, or did he leave right after? He went in with Miss Simon, and stayed for about half an hour. Stanford's eyes lit up, and there was a contained eagerness in his next question. Then he arrived around 11, and was alone with Miss Simon in her apartment until about 11:30. You're certain of this? Yes, sir, that's correct, the man confirmed. Stanford leaned in closer. Now, Harley, think carefully before you answer this. Did anyone else visit Miss Simon at any point last night? No one, sir, he replied without hesitation. How can you be so sure? I would have seen them, sir. They'd need to pass the switchboard to reach this apartment. And you don't ever leave the switchboard? Stanford asked. No, sir, the man assured him firmly, as if he were offended by the suggestion that he would abandon his post. When I need a drink of water or have to use the restroom, I just go to the little lavatory in the reception room, but I keep the door open and watch the switchboard in case a call comes in. Nobody could walk down the hall, even if I was in the lavatory, without my noticing. It was easy to believe that the diligent Harley kept a constant watch on the switchboard, ensuring no call went unanswered. His earnestness and reliability shone through, and I think there was no doubt in any of our minds that if Miss Simon had received another visitor that night, Harley would have been aware of it. But Oscar, true to his thorough nature, quickly stood up and stepped into the main hall. Moments later he returned, his expression a mix of concern and satisfaction. Right, he nodded at Stanford. The lavatory door is in a straight, clear line with the switchboard. Harley seemed unfazed by this confirmation and kept his focus on the district attorney, awaiting any further questions. There was something both commendable and reassuring about his calm demeanor. "What about last night?" Stanford continued. "Did you leave the switchboard often or for long?" "Just once, sir, and that was only for a minute or two to use the lavatory. I kept my eyes on the board the whole time." "And you'd be willing to swear that no one else visited Miss Simon after 10 o'clock, and that no one, apart from her escort, left her apartment after that time?" "Yes, sir, I would." It was clear he was being honest, and Stanford took a moment to think before moving on. "What about the side door?" "That remains locked all night, sir. The janitor secures it when he leaves and unlocks it in the morning. I never touch it." Stanford leaned back and turned to Oscar. "The testimony from the janitor, and Harley here, seems to narrow things down to Miss Simon's escort. If we assume the side door was indeed locked all night, and that no one else came or went through the front door, then it seems the man we need to find is the one who brought her home." Oscar let out a short, humorless laugh. "That would be great, sir, if something else hadn't occurred around here last night." Then, turning to Harley, he said, "Tell the district attorney the rest of the story about this man." Stanford looked at the operator with keen interest, while Quentin propped himself on one elbow and listened intently. Harley spoke steadily, with the disciplined and careful tone of a soldier reporting to his commanding officer. "It was just this, sir. When the gentleman stepped out of Miss Simon's apartment around 11:30, he paused at the switchboard and asked me to call a yellow taxicab for him. I connected the call, and while he waited for the car, Miss Simon suddenly screamed and called for help. The gentleman spun around and hurried to the apartment door, with me following closely behind. He knocked, but at first there was no response. He knocked again and shouted out to Miss Simon, asking what was wrong. This time she responded, saying everything was fine, and told him to go home and not to worry. He then walked back with me to the switchboard and remarked that he figured Miss Simon must have dozed off and had a nightmare. We chatted for a few minutes about the war until the taxicab finally arrived. He said good night and left, and I heard the car pull away. It was clear that this account of Miss Simon's anonymous visitor threw Stanford's theory into disarray. He looked down at the floor, confusion written across his face, and smoked thoughtfully for several moments. Finally, he asked, "How long after the man left the apartment did you hear Miss Simon scream?" "About 5 minutes. I had connected with the taxicab company, and it was about a minute later that she screamed." "Was the man close to the switchboard?" "Yes, sir. In fact, he had one arm resting on it." "How many times did Miss Simon scream? And what exactly did she shout when she called for help?" "She screamed twice and then yelled, 'Help, help.'" "And when the man knocked on the door the second time, what did he say?" "If I remember correctly, sir, he said, 'Open the door, Eleanor. What's the trouble?'" "Can you recall her exact words when she responded?" Harley hesitated, frowning as he thought it over. "As far as I can remember," she said, "there's nothing wrong. I'm sorry I screamed." "Everything is fine, so please go home and don't worry." Of course, that may not be exactly what she said, but it was something very close to it. "You could hear her clearly through the door, then?" "Oh, yes. These doors aren't very thick." Stanford stood up and began pacing thoughtfully. After a moment, he stopped in front of the operator and asked another question. "Did you hear any other suspicious sounds in this apartment after the man left?" "Not a sound at all, sir," Harley replied. "However, someone from outside the building called Miss Simon about 10 minutes later, and a man's voice answered from her apartment." "What's this?" Stanford turned quickly, and Oscar sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Tell me every detail of that call." Harley answered, without showing any emotion. "About 20 minutes before midnight, a trunk light flashed on the board, and when I picked it up, a man asked for Miss Simon. I connected the call, and after a short wait, the receiver was lifted from her phone. You can tell when that happens because the guide light on the board goes out, and a man's voice said hello. I pulled the listening key over, but didn't hear anything more. Silence filled the apartment for several moments. Then Quentin, who had been observing Harley closely during the conversation, spoke up. "By the way, Mr. Harley," he asked casually, "were you, by any chance, a bit taken by the lovely Miss Simon?" For the first time since entering the room, Harley seemed uncomfortable. A dull flush spread across his cheeks. "I thought she was a very beautiful lady," he replied firmly. Stanford shot Quentin a disapproving glance before turning to the operator. "That will be all for now, Harley." The man bowed stiffly and limped out. "This case is getting really intriguing," Quentin said, settling back into the Davenport. "Well, it's nice to know someone's finding it enjoyable," Stanford replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "And what, may I ask, was the point of your question about Harley's feelings toward the deceased?" "Oh, just a random thought wandering through my mind," Quentin replied casually. "Besides, a little gossip always brightens up a situation, doesn't it?" Oscar, pulling himself from his gloomy thoughts, spoke up. "We still have the fingerprints, Mr. Stanford. I think they're going to help us find our man." "Even if Dubois identifies those prints," Stanford said, "we still need to prove how their owner got into this place last night. He'll likely claim they were left here before the crime." "Well, it's certain," Oscar insisted stubbornly, "that someone was here last night when Simon returned from the theater, and that he was still around after the other man left at 11:30. The woman's screams and the phone call at 20 minutes to midnight support that. And since Doc Dormus said the murder happened before midnight, it's undeniable that the guy hiding here committed the crime." "That seems undeniable," Stanford agreed. "I suspect it was someone she knew. She probably screamed when he first showed himself, but once she recognized him, she calmed down and told the other man outside that everything was fine. Then later, he strangled her." "And I might add," Quentin suggested, "that his hiding spot was likely that clothes press." "Certainly," Sergeant agreed. "But what's troubling me is how he managed to get in here." The day operator, who had manned the switchboard until 10 last night, told me that the only visitor she had seen was the man who took Simon out to dinner. Stanford let out an irritated grunt. "Bring the day man in here," he commanded. "We need to get to the bottom of this. Someone managed to sneak in here last night, and before I leave, I'm going to figure out how it was done." Quentin gave him a patronizing smile. "You know, Stanford," he said, "I may not have the gift of foresight, but I can't shake this odd feeling, as the lesser poets might say, that if you really plan to stay in this cluttered room until you uncover how our mysterious visitor got in last night, you might want to gather your toiletries and pack some fresh clothes, not to mention your pajamas. The fellow who orchestrated this little gathering clearly thought through his entrance and exit very carefully." Stanford looked at Quentin with doubt, but didn't respond. Chapter 7. Nameless Visitor. Tuesday, June 11, 11:15 a.m. Oscar stepped into the hallway and soon returned with the day telephone operator, a pale young man named Spively. His almost black hair, slicked back with pomade, highlighted his sallow complexion, and he sported a thin mustache that barely reached the edges of his nostrils. He was dressed in an overly fashionable chocolate-colored suit that hugged his frame, complemented by cloth-topped buttoned shoes and a pink shirt with a stiff collar. He appeared anxious, immediately sinking into a wicker chair by the door, fidgeting with the sharp creases of his trousers and running his tongue across his lips. Stanford got right to the point. "I hear you were at the switchboard yesterday afternoon and last night until 10. Is that right?" Spively swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." "What time did Miss Simon leave for dinner?" "About 7. I had just sent to the restaurant next door for some sandwiches." "Did she go by herself?" Stanford cut in, eagerness clear in his voice. "No, a guy came to pick her up." "Do you know this guy?" "I'd seen him a couple of times when he came to see Miss Simon, but I didn't know who he was." "What did he look like?" Stanford asked, impatience creeping into his tone. Spively's description of the girl's companion matched Harley's account of the man who had walked her home, though Spively was more talkative and less precise than Harley had been. Clearly, Miss Simon had left at 7 and returned at 11, accompanied by the same man. "Now," Stanford continued, emphasizing his words, "I need to know who else visited Miss Simon between the time she went out to dinner and 10 o'clock, when you left the switchboard." Spively looked confused, his thin, arched eyebrows rising and falling. "I don't understand," he stammered. "How could anyone visit Miss Simon while she was out?" "Someone clearly did," replied Stanford. "He got into her apartment and was there when she returned at 11. The young man's eyes widened, and his mouth fell open. "My God, sir," he exclaimed. "So that's how they murdered her. They must have been waiting for her." He halted abruptly, suddenly aware of how closely he was tied to the events that led to the crime. "But nobody entered her apartment while I was on duty," he said, his voice trembling. "Nobody. I never left the board from the time she went out until my shift ended. Is it possible someone could have come in through the side door?" "What, was it unlocked?" Spively's voice was incredulous. "It's never unlocked at night. The janitor locks it when he leaves at 6. And you didn't unlock it last night for any reason. Think." "No, sir, I did." He shook his head earnestly. "Are you sure that no one gained entry through the front door after Miss Simon left?" "Absolutely. I promise I didn't leave the board at all, and no one could have bypassed me without my noticing. There was only one person who called and asked for her." "Oh, so someone did call," Stanford snapped. "When was that? And what happened, exactly? Take a moment to recall before you respond." "It wasn't anything significant," the young man reassured him, genuinely unnerved. "Just a guy who came in, rang the bell, and then left right away." "Don't concern yourself with whether it was significant or not." Stanford's voice was cold and authoritative. "What time did he arrive?" "About 9:30. "And who was he?" "A young guy I've seen come by a few times to see Miss Simon. I don't know his name." "Tell me precisely what happened," Stanford pressed on. Spively swallowed hard and moistened his lips. "It went like this," he began, clearly straining to recall. "The guy came in and started walking down the hall, and I told him, Miss Simon isn't here. But he just kept on walking and said, 'Oh well, I'll ring the bell anyway to be sure.' Just then a phone call came in, and I let him continue. He rang the bell and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Before long he came back and said, 'I guess you were right.' Then he tossed me $50 and left." "You actually saw him leave?" A hint of disappointment crept into Stanford's voice. "Of course I saw him leave." He paused just inside the front door to light a cigarette. Then he opened the door and headed down toward Broadway. "One by one, the rosy petals fall," came Quentin's lazy voice. "What a decidedly amusing situation." Stanford was reluctant to give up hope that this one visitor, who had come and gone at 9:30, might hold some criminal potential. "What was this man like?" he asked. "Can you describe him?" Spively sat up straighter, and when he spoke, his enthusiasm revealed that he had paid close attention to the visitor. He was handsome, not too old, maybe around 30. He was wearing a formal suit and shiny black shoes, with a pleated silk shirt. What? Quentin interjected, feigning disbelief as he leaned over the back of the Davenport. "A silk shirt with evening attire." "Most extraordinary." "Oh, many of the best-dressed gents are sporting them," Spively explained with a hint of snobbery. "It's all the rage for dancing." "Is that so, really?" Quentin responded, looking utterly amazed. "I need to check this out. By the way, when this Beau Brummel in the silk shirt paused by the front door, did he pull out his cigarette from a long, flat silver case tucked in his waistcoat pocket?" The young man stared at Quentin in awe. "How did you know?" he asked, astonished. "Simple deduction," Quentin replied, reclining back in his seat. "Large metal cigarette cases in the waistcoat pocket just seem to go with silk shirts for the evening." Stanford, clearly irritated by the interruption, sharply urged the operator to continue with his description. He wore his hair slicked down, Spively continued, and you could see it was somewhat long, but cut in the latest style. He had a small waxed mustache, a big carnation in the lapel of his coat, and chamois gloves on. "My word," Quentin murmured, "a gigolo." Stanford, weighed down by the burdens of the nightclubs, frowned and took a deep breath. Quentin's comment seemed to have led him down an unwelcome path of thought. "Was this man short or tall?" he asked next. "He wasn't very tall, about my height," Spively replied, "and he was kind of thin." There was an undeniable tone of admiration in his voice, and I sensed that this young telephone operator saw in Miss Simon's visitor a certain physical and fashion ideal. This clear admiration, combined with the rather extravagant attire favored by the youth, allowed us to glean a fairly accurate image of the man who had unsuccessfully rung the dead girl's bell at 9:30 the previous night. Once Spively was dismissed, Stanford rose and began pacing the room, his head clouded in cigar smoke, while Oscar sat quietly observing him, his brow furrowed. Quentin stood up and stretched his limbs. "It seems the mystery remains unchanged," he said casually. "How on earth did the lovely Eleanor's executioner manage to get in?" "You know, Mr. Stanford," Oscar said thoughtfully, "I've been considering that the man might have slipped in earlier in the afternoon, before that side door was locked. Perhaps Simon herself let him in and hid him when the other gentleman arrived to take her to dinner." "That does seem plausible," Stanford agreed. "Let's bring the maid back in here and see what we can uncover." When the maid returned, Stanford questioned her about her activities that afternoon. She explained that she had gone out around 4 to do some shopping and had come back around 5:30. "Did Miss Simon have any visitors while you were away?" "No, sir," she replied promptly. "She was alone." "Did she mention anyone stopping by?" "No, sir." "Now," Stanford continued, "could there have been anyone hiding in this apartment when you returned at 7? The maid looked genuinely surprised, even a bit alarmed. "Where could anyone possibly hide?" she asked, scanning the room. "There are several potential spots," Stanford suggested. "In the bathroom, in one of the closets, under the bed, or behind the drapes." She shook her head resolutely. "No one could have been hidden," she asserted. "I was in the bathroom at least 6 times, and I fetched Miss Simon's dress from the closet in the bedroom. As soon as it started to get dark, I pulled all the shades myself. And the bed, it's almost touching the floor. No one could fit under it." I glanced at the bed and realized she was right. "And what about the closet in this room?" Stanford asked hopefully, but again the maid shook her head. "There was no one in there. That's where I keep my own hat and coat, and I took those out myself when I was getting ready to leave. I even put away one of Miss Simon's old dresses in that closet before I left." "And you're absolutely sure," Stanford pressed, "that no one could have been hidden anywhere in these rooms when you went home?" "Absolutely, sir." "Do you remember if the key to this clothes closet was on the inside or outside of the lock when you opened the door to grab your hat?" The woman paused, considering the closet door carefully. "It was on the outside, just like it always is," she said after a moment. "I remember because it got caught in the chiffon of the old dress I put away." Stanford frowned, then continued his questioning. "You mentioned you don't know the name of Miss Simon's dinner companion from last night. Do you know the names of any gentlemen she usually went out with?" "Miss Simon never mentioned any names to me," the woman replied. "She was very careful about that, secretive, you might say. You see, I only work during the day, and the men she knew generally came in the evening." "And you never heard her talk about anyone she was frightened of, anyone who might have given her reason to be afraid?" "No, sir, though there was one man she was trying to shake off. He was a bad sort. I wouldn't have trusted him at all, and I warned Miss Simon to watch out for him. But she had known him for a long time, I think, and she seemed pretty fond of him once." "What makes you say that?" "About a week ago," the maid recounted, I came in after lunch, and he was in the other room with her. They didn't hear me because the curtains were drawn. He was demanding money, and when she tried to brush him off, he started threatening her, and she said something that made it clear she had given him money before. I made a sound, and they stopped arguing. Soon enough, he left the room. "What did this man look like?" Stanford asked, his curiosity piqued. He was kind of thin, not very tall, and I'd say he was about 30. He had a tough-looking face. Some would call him good-looking, and pale blue eyes that sent chills down your spine. His hair was always slicked back, and he had a little yellow mustache that was pointed at the ends. "Ah," Quentin exclaimed, "our gigolo." "Has this man been here since?" Stanford inquired. "I don't know, sir, at least not while I was here." "That will be all," Stanford said, and the woman left. "She didn't help us much," Oscar complained. "What?" Quentin said, surprised. "I think she did quite well. She clarified several important points." "And which parts of her information do you find particularly enlightening?" Stanford asked, barely hiding his irritation. "We now know, do we not?" Quentin replied calmly, "that no one was hiding in here when the maid left yesterday evening." "Instead of that being useful," Stanford shot back, "I'd say it adds significantly to the complications." "It might seem that way, wouldn't it? But who knows? This might turn out to be your brightest and most reassuring clue. Furthermore, we learned that someone clearly locked themselves in that clothes press, given the shifting of the key, and that this hiding must have happened after the maid left, or let's say, sometime after 7 o'clock. "Sure," Oscar said sarcastically, when the side door was locked and someone was sitting in the front hall, swearing no one came in that way. "It is a bit puzzling," Quentin admitted with a hint of sadness. "Puzzling, it's impossible," Stanford grumbled. Oscar, now gazing thoughtfully into the closet, shook his head in frustration. "What I don't get," he pondered, "is why, if the guy was hiding in the closet, he didn't tear it apart when he came out, like he did with the rest of the apartment." "Sergeant," Quentin said, "you've hit the nail on the head. You know, the neat and untouched look of that closet suggests that the clumsy person who rummaged through these lovely rooms simply bypassed it, because it was locked from the inside and couldn't get it open." Now, Stanford protested. "That idea implies that there were 2 unknown individuals present here last night." Quentin sighed. "Ah, indeed, I realize that, and we can't logically fit even one into this apartment. It's quite frustrating, isn't it?" Oscar tried to find comfort in a different line of reasoning. "Regardless," he said, "we know that the sharply dressed man in patent leather shoes who showed up here last night around 9:30 was probably Simon's lover and was taking advantage of her." "And how does that obvious fact help clear up the situation?" Quentin asked. "Most modern Delilahs seem to have some greedy suitor. It would be quite strange if there weren't such a guy lurking around, right?" "That's fair enough," Oscar replied. "But here's something you might not realize, Mr. Quentin. The guys these women go crazy for are usually troublemakers of some kind, professional criminals, if you will. That's why, knowing this crime was carried out by a pro, it doesn't surprise me to find that the man threatening Simon and exploiting her is the same one who was hanging around here last night. And I'll add this, too. The description of him matches the kind of sophisticated burglars you might see in those upscale, all-night cafes." "So you believe," Quentin asked gently, "that this crime, as you put it, was committed by a professional thief?" Oscar almost sneered at the question. Didn't the guy wear gloves and use a crowbar? This was definitely a pro's job. Chapter 8. The Invisible Murderer. Tuesday, June 11, 11:45 a.m. Stanford approached the window, hands clasped behind him, gazing down into the small paved backyard. After a few moments, he turned slowly to face the others. "The way I see it," he began, "the situation comes down to this. The Simon girl had plans for dinner and the theater with a man of some repute. He arrived to pick her up a little after 7, and they left together. They returned at 11. He accompanied her into her apartment and stayed for half an hour. At 11:30, he asked the phone operator to call him a taxi. While he waited, the girl screamed for help, and in response to his inquiries, she insisted nothing was wrong and told him to leave. The taxi came, and he got in. 10 minutes later, someone called her, and a man answered from her apartment. This morning, she was found murdered, and the apartment was ransacked. He took a long drag from his cigar. It's clear that when she and her escort returned last night, another man was already in the apartment. It's also evident that the girl was alive after her escort left. Therefore, we must conclude that the man who was already inside is the one who murdered her. This is supported by Dr. Dormus's report, which indicates the crime took place between 11 and midnight. Since her escort didn't leave until 11:30 and had spoken with her after that time, we can reasonably estimate the murder happened sometime between 11:30 and midnight. These are the facts we can derive from the evidence we have so far. There's not much disputing that, Oscar agreed. Well, they sure are intriguing, Quentin murmured. As Stanford paced earnestly, he continued. Regarding these facts, we must consider the following. There was no one hiding in the apartment at 7 o'clock, the hour the maid went home. So the murderer must have entered the apartment later. Let's first look at the side door. At 6 o'clock, an hour before the maid left, the janitor locked it from the inside, and both workers firmly deny that they approached it. Additionally, Sergeant, you discovered it locked this morning. Therefore, we can conclude that the door was secured from the inside all night, meaning no one could have entered that way. Consequently, we must consider the only other possibility. The murderer came in through the front door. Now, let's evaluate this other entry option. The phone operator who was on duty until 10 o'clock last night confidently claims that the only person who entered through the front door and went down the main hall to this apartment was a man who rang the bell and, receiving no response, immediately left. The other operator, who took over from 10 o'clock until this morning, asserts just as strongly that no one entered the front door and passed the switchboard on their way to this apartment. To add to this, every window on this floor is barred, and anyone coming down from above would have to confront the operator, leaving us, for now, at a standstill. Oscar scratched his head and let out a dry laugh. It makes no sense at all, does it, sir? What about the next apartment? Quentin asked. The one with the door toward the back passage, number 2, if I recall correctly. Oscar looked at him with a hint of condescension. I checked that out first thing this morning. Apartment number 2 is occupied by a single woman. I woke her up at 8 o'clock and searched the place. Found nothing. Besides, you have to walk past the switchboard to get to her apartment, just like you do to reach this one, and no one visited her or left her apartment last night. What's more, Harley, who's a sharp guy, mentioned that this woman is a quiet, refined sort, and that she and Simon didn't even know each other. You're quite thorough, Sergeant, murmured Quentin. Of course, added Stanford. It's possible that someone from the other apartment could have slipped in here unnoticed between 7 and 11 and then slipped back out after the murder. But since Sergeant Oscar's search this morning didn't find anyone, we can rule out the chance of our suspect coming from that direction. I suppose you're right, Quentin replied with indifference. But it occurs to me, dear Stanford, that your own rather tedious recap of the situation effectively rules out the possibility of your suspect having come from anywhere at all. And yet he entered, strangled the poor girl, and left. Amazing, isn't it? This is quite the puzzle. I wouldn't want to miss it for the world. It's eerie, Stanford remarked gloomily. It's downright spiritual, Quentin chimed in. It has the distinct whiff of a seance. Honestly, I'm starting to wonder if some medium was lurking nearby last night, doing some rather impressive materializations. Tell me, Stanford, could you bring charges against an ectoplasmic manifestation? It wasn't a ghost that left those fingerprints, Oscar grumbled, his tone irritable. Stanford stopped his restless pacing and shot Quentin an annoyed look. Honestly, this is utter nonsense. The man got in somehow, and he got out too. There's something amiss here. Either the maid is mistaken about someone being here when she left, or one of those phone operators fell asleep and won't admit it. Or one of them is lying, Oscar interjected. Quentin shook his head. The maid, I would say, is altogether trustworthy, and if there were any doubt about someone getting in through the front door unnoticed, the guys on the switchboard would be more than eager to admit it under these circumstances. No, Stanford, you'll need to tackle this situation from a more celestial perspective, so to speak. Stanford grunted, clearly unimpressed by Quentin's humor. That approach is better suited to you and your philosophical musings. But think about it, Quentin said playfully. You've conclusively shown, or rather legally established, that no one could have entered or left this apartment last night. And as you've often told me, a court of law must resolve all matters based not on what we suspect, but on the evidence. In this case, the evidence would provide a solid alibi for everyone involved. And yet, it's hard to believe, don't you think, that the lady could have strangled herself? If only poison had been used, you'd have a beautifully tragic case of suicide. How inconsiderate of a murderous visitor to use hands instead of arsenic. Well, she was strangled, Oscar stated. Moreover, I suspect the man who came here last night at 9:30 and couldn't get in is the one we need to question. Oh, really? Quentin produced another cigarette. Based on our description of him, I doubt his conversation will be particularly enlightening. A dangerous glimmer appeared in Oscar's eyes. We have our methods, he replied through clenched teeth, for extracting interesting insights from people who aren't known for their charm. Quentin sighed. Oh, how the elite circles need you, my sergeant. Stanford checked his watch. I have urgent business at the office, he said. This discussion isn't moving us forward. He placed a hand on Oscar's shoulder. I trust you to move ahead. This afternoon, I'll have these individuals brought to my office for further questioning. Perhaps I can help jog their memories a bit. Do you have a plan for investigating this? The usual, Oscar replied with a sigh. I'll sift through Simon's papers, and I'll have a few of my men look into her. You should get in touch with the yellow taxicab company right away, Stanford suggested. See if you can find out who the man was that left here at 11:30 last night, and where he went. Do you really think, Quentin asked, that if this man had known anything about the murder, he would have stopped in the hallway and asked the operator to call a taxi? I'm not expecting much from that angle, Stanford said, his tone nearly lifeless. But the girl might have said something to him that could give us a clue. Quentin shook his head with a smirk. Ah, welcome, pure-eyed faith, white-handed hope, you hovering angel dressed in golden wings. Stanford wasn't in the mood for playful banter. He turned to Oscar and spoke with forced cheerfulness. Give me a call later this afternoon. I might uncover some new evidence from the folks we just interviewed. And, he added, make sure to have someone guard this place. I want this apartment left exactly as it is until we gather more information. I'll take care of that, Oscar assured him. Stanford, Quentin, and I stepped out and got into the car. A few minutes later, we were speeding across town through Central Park. Do you remember our recent discussion about footprints in the snow? Quentin asked, as we emerged onto Fifth Avenue and headed south. Stanford nodded, lost in thought. As I recall, Quentin continued, in the hypothetical scenario you laid out, there were not only footprints but also a dozen witnesses, including a young prodigy, who saw some figure cross the snowy landscape. Grau, Tura Frund, Istale theory. Here you are in a rather unpleasant situation because, sadly, there are neither footprints in the snow nor witnesses who saw a fleeing figure. In short, you're lacking both direct and circumstantial evidence. Such a sad affair. He shook his head sadly. You know, Stanford, it seems to me that the evidence in this case provides clear legal proof that no one was with the deceased at the time of her death, and thus she is presumably alive. The fact that the lady's body is found strangled is simply an irrelevant detail from a legal standpoint. I understand that you learned lawyers don't consider a murder without a body. But how, for heaven's sake, do you explain a body without a murder? You're talking nonsense, Stanford shot back, his irritation evident. Oh, quite, Quentin replied, unfazed. But it's rather distressing for a lawyer not to have any sort of evidence, isn't it, old friend? It leaves one feeling quite lost. Suddenly, Stanford turned to him. You, of course, don't need physical evidence or any other material clues, he said mockingly. You possess a kind of insight that ordinary people lack. If I remember correctly, you told me rather grandly that, understanding the nature of a crime, you could guide me straight to the culprit, regardless of whether they left any footprints. Do you recall that boast? Well, here we have a crime, and the culprit left no footprints at all. Please, do enlighten me on who killed the Simon girl. Quentin remained unruffled by Stanford's irritable challenge. He sat, smoking slowly for several moments, before leaning over to flick the ash from his cigarette out the window. Well, Stanford, he replied calmly, I'm rather tempted to look into this ridiculous murder, but I think I'll wait and see what the bewildered Oscar discovers with his investigation. Stanford scoffed and sank back into the cushions. Your generosity overwhelms me, he said. Chapter 9. The Pack in Full Cry. Tuesday, June 11, afternoon. As we made our way downtown that morning, we found ourselves caught in a considerable traffic jam just north of Madison Square, and Stanford kept glancing anxiously at his watch. It's past noon, he remarked. I think I'll stop by the club and grab a bite to eat. I assume that dining at this early hour would be too common for someone as refined as you. Quentin considered the invitation for a moment. Since you deprived me of my breakfast, he replied, I'll allow you to treat me to some eggs Benedict. A few minutes later, we entered the nearly vacant grill of the Beaumont Club and chose a table next to one of the windows that overlooked the treetops of Madison Square. Shortly after placing our order, a uniformed attendant entered, bowed respectfully at the district attorney's side, and presented an unaddressed note sealed in one of the club's envelopes. Stanford read it with growing curiosity, and as he examined the signature, surprise flickered across his face. Eventually, he nodded to the waiting attendant and excused himself, leaving us abruptly. He was gone for almost 20 minutes. Strange thing, he said upon returning. That note was from the man who took the Simon woman to dinner and the theater last night. It's a small world, he mused. He's staying here at the club. He's a non-resident member and uses it as his base when he's in town. You know him? Quentin asked, seeming uninterested. I've met him a few times, a guy named Trafford. Stanford appeared puzzled. He comes from a respectable family, lives in a country house on Long Island, and is typically seen as a highly regarded member of society, one of the last people I'd expect to be involved with the Simon girl. But by his own admission, he spent quite a bit of time with her during his visits to New York, sowing a few belated wild oats, as he put it, and last night he took her to Francel's for dinner, and then to the Winter Garden afterward. Not exactly what I'd call an intellectual or even an enlightening evening, Quentin remarked, and he chose a terribly unlucky day for it. Just imagine picking up the morning paper and finding out that your charming companion from the night before had been murdered. Quite unsettling, isn't it? He's certainly shaken up, Stanford replied. The early afternoon papers came out about an hour ago, and he'd been calling my office every 10 minutes by the time I walked in here. He's worried that his connection to the girl will come to light and cause him embarrassment. And won't it? I don't see why it should. No one knows who her date was last night, and since he clearly had nothing to do with the crime, what's the point in dragging him into it? He shared the whole story with me and offered to stay in the city as long as I needed him to. From the look of disappointment on your face when you returned, it seems his story didn't offer you any leads. Not at all, Stanford admitted. The girl clearly never discussed her personal life with him. He couldn't provide a single helpful hint. His version of last night's events matched perfectly with Harley's. He picked her up at 7, brought her home around 11, stayed with her for about half an hour, and then left. When he heard her scream for help, he panicked initially, but when she assured him there was nothing wrong, he figured she must have dozed off and was having a nightmare, so he didn't think much more of it. He went straight to the club here, arriving at about 10 minutes to 12. Judge Redfern, who saw him get out of the taxi, insisted he come upstairs and join a few men who were waiting in the judge's rooms to play poker with him. They played until 3 o'clock this morning. Your Long Island, Don Juan, certainly hasn't left you any footprints in the snow. Regardless, his coming forward at this time eliminates one line of inquiry that could have wasted a lot of our time. If more lines of inquiry keep closing like this, Quentin interjected dryly, you'll find yourself in quite the dilemma, you know. I still have enough options open to keep me busy, Stanford replied, pushing back his plate and asking for the check. He stood up, then paused to look at Quentin thoughtfully. Are you interested enough to join me? What, my word, I'd be delighted, of course. But do sit down for just a moment, be a good fellow, while I finish my coffee. I was quite surprised by Quentin's eager acceptance, casual and teasing though it was. He had planned to attend an exhibition of old Chinese prints at the Montrose Galleries that afternoon. There was to be a ryukai and a moyaki, said to be fine examples of Sung painting, and Quentin was especially keen to add them to his collection. We rode with Stanford to the Criminal Courts building, and after entering through the Franklin Street door, we took the private elevator to the spacious but somewhat dingy office of the district attorney, which overlooked the grey stone walls of the tombs. Quentin took a seat in one of the heavy leather chairs near the carved oak table to the right of the desk, lighting a cigarette with a look of cynical amusement. I'm looking forward to the wheels of justice turning, he said, leaning back lazily. You'll be disappointed. You won't hear the first turn of those wheels, Stanford shot back. The first movement will happen outside of this office. With that, he slipped through a swinging door that led to the judge's chambers. 5 minutes later, he returned and settled into the high-backed swivel chair at his desk, facing away from the 4 tall, narrow windows on the south wall of the office. I just spoke with Judge Redfern, he said, noting that it was the midday recess. He confirmed Trafford's account about the poker game. The judge ran into him outside the club 10 minutes before midnight and stayed with him until 3 in the morning. He remembers the time because he promised his guests he would return by 11:30 and ended up 20 minutes late. Why go to such lengths to confirm something so seemingly insignificant? Quentin asked. It's just procedure, Stanford replied, a hint of impatience in his voice. In a case like this, every detail, no matter how trivial, must be verified. Honestly, Stanford, Quentin reclined in his chair, gazing dreamily at the ceiling, one might think this endless routine that you lawyers hold in such reverence actually leads somewhere, when in reality it seems to get us nowhere. Remind you of the Red Queen in Through the Looking Glass. I'm too busy right now to argue over routine versus creativity, Stanford cut in briskly, pressing a button beneath the edge of his desk. Donovan, his eager young secretary, appeared in the doorway connecting the district attorney's office with the narrow inner chamber leading to the main waiting room. Yes, Chief. Donovan's eyes sparkled with anticipation behind his large horn-rimmed glasses. Tell Ben to send, in a man, immediately. Ben referred to Colonel Benjamin Hanlon, the commanding officer of the detective division linked to the district attorney's office. Donovan exited through the corridor door, and within a minute or two, a smooth, rotund man dressed impeccably and wearing a pince-nez walked in, standing before Stanford with a flattering smile. Good morning, Tracy. Stanford's tone was polite but brief. I need you to bring in 4 witnesses for the Simon case right away, the 2 phone operators, the maid, and the janitor. You'll find them at 184 West 71st Street. Sergeant Oscar is holding them there. Understood, sir. Tracy accepted the memo and gave a stiff but courteous bow as he left. During the next hour, Stanford delved into the mountain of work that had piled up that morning, and I was struck by the man's incredible energy and efficiency. He handled as many significant matters in that time as most business people would tackle in an entire day. Donovan zipped in and out with boundless enthusiasm, while various clerks appeared at the sound of a buzzer, received their instructions, and vanished in a blur. Quentin, seeking distraction in a heavy book about infamous arson trials, glanced up occasionally with admiration, shaking his head in light-hearted disapproval at such fervent activity. It was just past 2:30 when Donovan announced Tracy's return with the 4 witnesses. For the next 2 hours, Stanford interrogated and cross-examined them with a depth and insight that I, as a lawyer myself, had rarely witnessed. His approach with the 2 phone operators was markedly different from the casual questioning they had received that morning. If any relevant detail had gone unaddressed in their earlier statements, Stanford's rigorous questioning would surely have caught it. Yet when they were finally released, no new information had emerged. Their accounts remained solid. Aside from the girl and her escort, and the disappointed visitor at 9:30, no one had entered the front door and walked down the hall to the Simon apartment since 7 o'clock, nor had anyone exited that way. The janitor stubbornly insisted he had locked the side door shortly after 6, and no amount of persuasion or confrontation could shake his unwavering certainty on that matter. Amy Gibson, the maid, offered nothing new in her testimony. Stanford's thorough examination of her yielded only reiterations of what she had already said. No fresh possibilities, no new suggestions, came to light. The 2 hours of conversation had only managed to seal off every avenue in what was already an unbelievable situation. By 4:30, Stanford leaned back in his chair with a tired sigh, the hope of finding a viable solution to the astonishing problem seeming more distant than ever. Quentin set aside his research on arson and tossed his cigarette aside. "I'm telling you, Stanford, my friend," he said with a grin, "this case needs deep reflection, not just the usual protocols. Why not bring in an Egyptian psychic with a talent for crystal ball gazing?" "If this keeps up much longer," Stanford replied gloomily, "I might just take you up on that." At that moment, Donovan popped his head in to announce that Inspector Brenner was on the line. Stanford picked up the telephone and jotted down notes as he listened. Once the call ended, he turned to Quentin. "You seemed troubled by the state of the steel jewel case we found in the bedroom. Well, the expert on burglary tools just called back and confirmed his assessment from this morning. The case was pried open with a specially designed cold chisel, one that only a professional burglar would possess or know how to use. It had a beveled bit measuring 1 3/8 inches and a 1-inch flat handle. This tool was old. There's a distinct nick in the blade, and it's the same one used in a successful break-in on Park Avenue last summer. Does this exciting news ease your concerns?" "Not in the least." Quentin's expression became serious and troubled once again. "In fact, it makes everything even more bizarre. I could see a glimmer of hope, strange and otherworldly perhaps, but still a hint of clarity, in all this darkness if it weren't for that jewel case and the steel chisel." Stanford was about to respond when Donovan returned, stating that Sergeant Oscar had arrived and wanted to see him. Oscar appeared far less dejected than he had that morning. He accepted the cigar Stanford offered him and took a seat at the conference table in front of the district attorney's desk, pulling out a worn notebook. "We've had a bit of good fortune," he began. "Burke and Emery, 2 of the men I assigned to the case, managed to track down Simon right at the first place they inquired. From what they gathered, she didn't socialize with many men. She kept it to a few high rollers and played her cards close to her chest. The main one, who's been seen most often with her, is Charles Brady." Stanford perked up. "I know Brady, if it's the same guy." "It's definitely him," Oscar confirmed. "Former Brooklyn tax commissioner. He's been eyeing a pool hall for pony betting over in Jersey City ever since. He hangs out at the Beaumont Club, where he can mingle with his old Tammany hall buddies." "That's the one," Stanford nodded. "He's a bit of a notorious ladies' man, goes by Pop, I believe." Quentin stared into the distance. "Well, well," he murmured. "So old Pop Brady was also involved with our shrewd and charming dolers. She certainly wouldn't have been drawn to him for his good looks." "I thought, sir," Oscar continued, that since Brady is always at the Beaumont Club, it might be worthwhile to ask him a few questions about Simon. He should have some information. Happy to do that, Sergeant. Stanford made a note on his pad. I'll try to reach him tonight. Anyone else on your list? There's a guy named Louis Julian, who met Simon back when she was in the Follies. But she dropped him over a year ago, and they haven't been spotted together since. He's involved with another girl now. He runs the firm Julian and Levine, fur importers, and he's a regular at nightclubs, a big spender. I don't think there's much point in pursuing that angle. The thing with Simon was over too long ago. Right, Stanford agreed. I think we can rule him out. I must say, if you keep eliminating suspects at this rate, Quentin remarked, there won't be anything left but the lady's remains. Then there's the man who took her out last night, Oscar continued. Nobody seems to know his name. He must be one of those discreet types. At first I thought it might have been Brady, but the descriptions don't match. By the way, sir, there's an interesting detail. When he left Simon last night, he took a cab to the Beaumont Club and got out there. Stanford nodded. I'm aware of that, Sergeant. I know who the man is, and it was Brady. Quentin chuckled. The Beaumont Club certainly seems to be at the center of this investigation. I hope it doesn't meet the same fate as the Knickerbocker Athletic. Quentin was referencing the infamous Marlinux case, which in 1898 marked the decline of the old Knickerbocker Athletic Club on Madison Avenue and 45th Street. In contrast, it was commercialism that sealed the fate of the Beaumont. This club, located on the north side of Madison Square, was demolished a few years later to make way for a skyscraper. Oscar focused on the main issue. Who was the man, Mr. Stanford? Stanford hesitated, considering whether to share his knowledge. Then he replied, I'll tell you his name, but this is strictly between us. The man was Kenneth Trafford. He then recounted how he had been called away from lunch, and how he couldn't get any useful information from Trafford. He also updated Oscar on how he had confirmed Trafford's movements after meeting Judge Redfern at the club. And, added Stanford, since he clearly left the girl before she was murdered, there's no reason to question him. I promised him I'd keep him out of it for his family's sake. If you're satisfied, sir, then so am I. Oscar closed his notebook and set it aside. There's one more thing. Simon used to live on 110th Street, and Emery tracked down her former landlady. Turns out, the fancy guy the maid mentioned used to visit her regularly. That reminds me, Sergeant. Stanford picked up the notes he had jotted down during Inspector Brenner's call. Here's some information the professor gave me about how the jewel case was forced open. Oscar examined the paper with keen interest. Just as I suspected, he said, nodding in approval. It's a clear-cut professional job, done by someone experienced in this line of work. Quentin stirred from his reverie. Still, if that's the case, he remarked, why did this seasoned burglar first attempt it with an inadequate poker? And why did he ignore the clothes press in the living room? I'll get to the bottom of that, Mr. Quentin, once I catch up with him, Oscar replied, a steely look in his eyes. And the person I want to have a quiet little chat with is the one wearing the pleated silk shirt and chamois gloves. To each their own, sighed Quentin. For my part, I have no desire to speak with him. I simply can't imagine a professional thief trying to pry open a steel box with a cast-iron poker. Forget the poker, Oscar retorted gruffly. He used a steel chisel to break into the box, and that same chisel was involved in another burglary on Park Avenue last summer. What do you make of that? Ah, that's what troubles me, Sergeant. If it weren't for that troubling fact, you see, I'd be carefree this afternoon, enjoying a pleasant cup of tea at Claremont. Just then, Detective Bellamy was announced, and Oscar jumped to his feet. That must mean news about those fingerprints, he said, hope shining in his eyes. Bellamy walked in with a calm demeanor and approached the district attorney's desk. Captain Dubois sent me over, he stated. He thought you'd want the report on those Simon prints. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, flat folder, which he handed to Oscar at Stanford's nod. "We've identified them. Both were made by the same hand, just as Captain Dubois said, and that hand belongs to Tony Porter." "Dude Porter, huh?" The sergeant's voice trembled with barely contained excitement. "Well, Mr. Stanford, this takes us somewhere. Porter's an ex-con and quite skilled in his profession." He opened the folder, revealing an oblong card and a sheet of blue paper filled with typewritten lines. He examined the card, nodded in satisfaction, and passed it to Stanford. Quentin and I moved closer to see. At the top was the familiar photo from the rogues gallery, showing both the front and profile of a young man with regular features, thick hair, and a square jaw. His wide-set, pale eyes were beneath a neatly trimmed moustache with carefully styled ends. Below the double photograph was a brief description outlining his name, aliases, residence, Bertillon measurements, and details about his criminal activities. Beneath this were 10 small boxes arranged in 2 rows, each showing a fingerprint impression in black ink, the top row for the right hand and the bottom for the left. "So this is the trendsetter who brought the silk shirt into formal wear. Incredible," Quentin commented sarcastically as he looked at the identification card. "I just wish he'd start a fashion for gaiters with dinner jackets. These New York theaters get exceedingly drafty in the winter." Oscar placed the card back into the folder and skimmed the typewritten paper that accompanied it. "He's definitely our guy, Mr. Stanford. Listen to this. Tony Dude Porter. 2 years at Elmira Reformatory, 1902 to 1904. 1 year in Baltimore County Jail for petty theft, 1906. 3 years in San Quentin for assault and robbery, 1908 to 1911. Arrested in Chicago for breaking and entering, 1912. Case dismissed. Arrested and tried for burglary in Albany, 1913. No conviction. Served 2 years and 8 months in Sing Sing for housebreaking and burglary from 1914 to 1916. He folded the paper and tucked it, along with the card, into his breast pocket. Quite the charming record. "Is that what you were after?" asked the unflappable Bellamy. "Absolutely," Oscar replied, almost cheerfully. Bellamy lingered expectantly, keeping one eye on the district attorney, while Stanford, as if suddenly recalling something, pulled out a box of cigars and offered it. "Thank you, sir," said Bellamy, grabbing 2 mi favoritas. He carefully placed them in his waistcoat pocket and left the room. "I'll use your phone now, if you don't mind, Mr. Stanford," said Oscar. He dialed the Homicide Bureau. "Find Tony Porter, Dude Porter, immediately and bring him in as soon as you locate him," he instructed Barron. "Get his address from the files, and take Burke and Emery with you. If he's already skipped town, issue a general alert and have him picked up. Some of the guys might have a lead on him. Lock him up without booking, got it? And listen closely. Search his room for burglary tools. He probably won't have any lying around, but I'm particularly looking for a 1 3/8 inch chisel with a nick in the blade. I'll be at headquarters in half an hour." He hung up the phone and rubbed his hands together. "Now we're getting somewhere," he exclaimed. Quentin had moved to the window, staring down at the bridge of sighs, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Slowly, he turned and fixed Oscar with a thoughtful gaze. "This simply won't do, you know," he asserted. "Your friend, the dude, may have pried open that blasted box, but his head doesn't quite fit the rest of last evening's situation." Oscar scoffed. "Not being a phrenologist, I'm going by the shape of his fingerprints." "That's a regrettable misstep in criminal reasoning, my dear Sergeant," Quentin replied sweetly. "The matter of guilt in this case isn't as straightforward as you think. It's quite complicated. And this exquisite figure, the very image of style and grace that you hold close to your heart, has only deepened its complexity." Chapter 10. Forced Interview. Tuesday, June 11, 8 p.m. Stanford had dinner at the Beaumont Club, as he often did, and he invited Quentin and me to join him. He likely thought our presence would shield him from unwanted interruptions, as he wasn't in the mood for idle chatter from acquaintances. The rain had started to fall in the late afternoon, and by the time dinner ended, It had turned into a steady downpour that promised to last through the night. After finishing our meal, the three of us moved to a quiet corner of the lounge, settling in for a long smoke. We had barely been there for 15 minutes when a slightly round man, with a heavy, flushed face and thin grey hair, approached us with a stealthy, self-assured stride and greeted Stanford with a cheerful good evening. Although I didn't know him personally, I recognized him as Charles Brady. "I got your note at the front desk saying you wanted to see me." His voice was unexpectedly soft for a man of his size, yet beneath that softness there was a calculating and icy undertone. Stanford stood up and shook hands with him before introducing Quentin and me, although it appeared that Quentin had known him, at least a little, for some time. Brady took the seat Stanford offered him, pulled out a Corona cigar, expertly cut the end with a gold clipper attached to his heavy watch chain, rolled the cigar between his lips to moisten it, and lit it, shielding the flame with his hands. "I regret having to trouble you, Mr. Brady," Stanford began, "but as you may have seen in the papers, a young woman named Eleanor Simon was murdered last night in her apartment on 71st Street. He paused, seemingly weighing how best to approach such a sensitive topic, perhaps hoping that Brady would offer up any connection he might have had with the young woman. But not a single muscle on the man's face shifted. After a moment, Stanford pressed on. "In my inquiries about the young woman's life, I found that you, among others, knew her quite well." He paused again. Brady raised his eyebrows slightly, but remained silent. "The truth is," Stanford continued, slightly irked by the other man's calculated demeanor, "my report indicates you were seen with her multiple times over nearly 2 years. The only conclusion I can draw from what I've gathered is that you were more than just casually interested in Miss Simon." "Yes," the question was gentle, yet offered no commitment. "Yes," Stanford reiterated, "and I must stress, Mr. Brady, that this is not the time for pretense or holding back. I'm speaking to you tonight largely in my official capacity, because I believe you might assist me in unraveling this situation. It's fair to mention that a certain individual is under serious suspicion, and we hope to apprehend him shortly. Regardless, we will need your assistance, which is why I requested this conversation with you at the club." "And how can I help you?" Brady's expression was unreadable. Only his lips displayed movement as he spoke. "Knowing this young woman as well as you did," Stanford explained patiently, "you must possess some information, perhaps certain facts or confidences, that could shed light on her brutal and seemingly unexpected murder." Brady remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wall ahead, his features otherwise unyielding. "I'm afraid I can't help you," he finally replied. "Your response isn't quite what one might expect from someone with a clear conscience," Stanford remarked, a hint of resentment coloring his tone. Brady met the district attorney's gaze with mild curiosity. "What does knowing the girl have to do with her murder? She never confided in me about who her killer might be. She didn't even mention that she knew anyone who wanted to strangle her. If she had, she probably could have avoided being murdered." Quentin sat close to me, slightly apart from the others, and leaned over to whisper in my ear. "Stanford's up against another lawyer, poor thing, quite the mess." But no matter how poorly the conversation started, it quickly escalated into a serious clash that ended with Brady's complete defeat. Stanford, despite his charm and politeness, was a relentless and clever opponent. It wasn't long before he had extracted some crucial information from Brady. At Brady's ironically evasive response, Stanford turned sharply, leaning forward. "You're not on the stand defending yourself, Mr. Brady," he said sharply, "no matter how much you seem to think you're entitled to that role." Brady glared at him, saying nothing. Stanford held his gaze, intent on reading the man before him, but Brady seemed equally determined to hide his thoughts. His face was as stone-cold as a desert landscape. Finally, Stanford leaned back in his chair. "It doesn't really matter whether you choose to talk tonight at the club or not," he said casually. "If you prefer to be escorted to my office in the morning by a sheriff with a subpoena, I'm more than happy to arrange that. That's your call, Brady shot back, hostile. And what the newspapers say about it will be up to the reporters, Stanford replied. I'll explain things to them and give them a verbatim account of our conversation. But I have nothing to share, Brady said, his tone suddenly more conciliatory. The thought of publicity clearly unsettled him. You mentioned that earlier, Stanford said coolly. So I wish you a good evening. He turned to Quentin and me, the expression of a man who had wrapped up an unpleasant encounter. However, Brady remained where he was, making no move to leave. He smoked thoughtfully for a minute or two, then let out a short, hard laugh that didn't change the expression on his face. Oh, come on, he grumbled, forcing a smile. As you mentioned, I'm not in the hot seat. What do you want to know? I've laid out the situation, Stanford replied, irritation creeping into his voice. You know the kind of information I'm after. How did this Simon girl live? Who were her close friends? Who might have wanted her gone? What enemies did she have? We need anything that could help explain her death. And just so you know, he added with a sharp edge, anything to clear you of any suspicion, direct or indirect, in this matter. Brady stiffened at those last words and opened his mouth to protest indignantly, but he quickly shifted gears. With a contemptuous smile, he pulled out a leather pocket case, took out a small folded paper, and handed it to Stanford. I can clear myself without any trouble, he declared confidently. Here's a speeding ticket from Boonton, New Jersey. Check the date and time, June 10th, last night, at 11:30. I was driving down to Hopatcong when a motorcycle cop got me just after I passed Boonton and was heading for Mountain Lakes. I have to show up in court there tomorrow morning. It's a real hassle, these country cops. He regarded Stanford with a calculating look. You couldn't help me out with that, could you? It's a lengthy trip to Jersey, and I have a lot on my plate tomorrow. Stanford, having glanced at the ticket casually, slipped it into his pocket. I'll take care of it for you, he promised, smiling kindly. Now tell me what you know. Brady puffed on his cigar, thinking for a moment. Then, leaning back and crossing his legs, he spoke with feigned openness. I doubt I have much that will help you. I like the Cardinal, as she was called. Actually, I was quite fond of her once. I did a lot of foolish things. I wrote her all sorts of silly letters when I went to Cuba last year. I even had my picture taken with her down in Atlantic City. He grimaced, a self-reproachful look crossing his face. Then she started to act cool and distant, cancelled several appointments with me. I tried to confront her about it, but all she wanted was money. He paused, staring at the ash on his cigar. A fierce hatred flickered in his narrowed eyes, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. No point in lying. She had those letters and other things, and she got a nice amount of money from me before I got them back. When did this happen? There was a brief pause. Last June, Brady replied, then hurriedly added, Mr. Stanford. His voice dripped with bitterness. I don't mean to slander someone who's passed, but that woman was the most cunning, cold-blooded blackmailer I've ever encountered. And I can tell you this, I wasn't the only one she targeted. I know she had others wrapped around her finger. I heard she once managed to get quite a bit out of old Lowy Julian. He told me about it. Can you provide the names of any of these other men? Stanford asked, trying to mask his eagerness. I've already heard about the incident with Julian. No, I can't. Brady's tone was regretful. I've seen the Cardinal here and there with different men, and there's one in particular I've noticed recently, but they were all strangers to me. I assume the Julian incident is long gone by now. Yes, ancient history. You won't find any leads there, but there are others, more recent than Julian, who could be worth investigating if you manage to find them. I'm pretty easygoing myself. I take things as they come. But a lot of men would fly off the handle if they went through what I did with her. Despite his confession, Brady struck me more as a cold, composed, and calculated man, whose steady demeanor was always influenced by strategy and self-interest. Stanford studied him intently. So, you think her death could have been motivated by revenge from some heartbroken admirer? Brady took a moment to weigh his response. That sounds plausible, he finally replied. She was asking for trouble. A brief silence followed. Then Stanford inquired further. Do you know of a young man she was interested in? Good-looking, small, with a blonde mustache and light blue eyes, named Porter. Brady scoffed. That wasn't really her type. She kept her distance from the younger men, as far as I can tell. Just then, a page boy approached Brady and bowed slightly. Excuse me, sir, but there's a phone call for your brother. The caller said it was important, and since your brother isn't at the club right now, the operator thought you might know where he is. Why would I know? Brady snapped, irritated. Don't bother me with his calls. Your brother in the city? Stanford asked casually. I met him years ago. He's from San Francisco, right? Yes, enthusiastic Californian. He's in New York for a couple of weeks, so he'll appreciate Frisco more when he gets back. It seemed to me that Brady shared this information grudgingly, and I sensed that he was somewhat annoyed for some reason. But Stanford, clearly focused on the matter at hand, quickly returned to the topic of the murder. I know of one man who seemed to be interested in the Simon woman lately. He might be the same one you've seen her with, tall, around 45, with a grey, closely trimmed moustache. I recognized he was describing Trafford. That's the guy, Brady confirmed. I saw them together just last week at Mauquin. Stanford looked disappointed. Unfortunately, he's already been ruled out, but there must be someone who was close to her. Are you sure you can't think of anyone who might help? Brady seemed to ponder this. If it's just someone who had her trust, he said, I could mention Dr. Jensen. His first name is Ambrose, I think. He lives somewhere in the 40s near Lexington Avenue. I'm not sure he'd be of any help to you. Still, he was pretty close to her once. Are you suggesting that this Dr. Jensen might have had feelings for her beyond just being her doctor? I wouldn't want to make that assumption. Brady paused to smoke, as though weighing his thoughts. Anyway, here are the facts. Jensen is one of those high society specialists, a neurologist, as he likes to call himself, and I believe he runs a private sanitarium for anxious women. He must have quite a bit of money, and his social status certainly benefits him. He's exactly the kind of person the Cardinal might have chosen to help financially. And I know this. He visited her far more frequently than a typical doctor would. I ran into him one evening at her apartment, and when she introduced us, he wasn't even polite. It's worth looking into, at least, Stanford replied, sounding less than enthusiastic. You don't have anyone else in mind who might know something useful? Brady shook his head. No, nobody. And she never mentioned anything to you that would suggest she feared someone or expected trouble? Not a word. To be honest, I was completely stunned by the news. I only read the Morning Herald, other than the daily racing form at night, of course. Since there was no mention of the murder in this morning's paper, I didn't find out until just before dinner. The guys in the billiard room were talking about it, and then I stepped out to grab an afternoon paper. If it hadn't been for that, I might not have known until tomorrow morning. Stanford talked through the case with him until 8:30, but couldn't draw out any additional insights. Finally, Brady stood to leave. Sorry I couldn't be more helpful, he said, his round face now beaming as he shook hands with Stanford warmly. You handled that slippery old sport pretty well, you know, Quentin noted when Brady had left. But there's something decidedly strange about him. The shift from his gambler's glazed look to his chatty confessions was too abrupt. Much too abrupt, actually. I might be cynical, but he didn't strike me as a shining example of honesty. Perhaps it was his cold, unfeeling eyes that bothered me. Somehow they clashed with his eager performance of open-hearted honesty. We should cut him some slack, considering his awkward situation, Stanford suggested kindly. It's not easy to admit being deceived and blackmailed by a smooth talker. Still, if he received his letters back in June, why did he keep pursuing the lady? Oscar mentioned he was involved with her right up until the very end. He might just be a hopeless romantic, Stanford said with a smile. Somewhat like Abra, don't you think? Abra was ready before I called her name, and even though I called for another, Abra came. Perhaps, yes, he could fit the mold of a modern Cayley Drummel. Regardless, he has given us, in Dr. Jensen, a potential source of information. Absolutely, Quentin agreed. And that's the only aspect of his whole dramatic tale that I find any value in, because it was the only part he approached with any real restraint. I suggest we get in touch with this doctor about the fairer sex without delay. I'm exhausted, Stanford protested. Let's put it off until tomorrow. Quentin glanced at the large clock above the stone mantel. I'll admit it's getting late, but why not, as Pittacus said, seize the moment? Those who let fortune slip away will never find it again. Once opportunity has passed, it's lost. But the elder Cato had him beat. In his Disticcia de Moribus, he wrote, front capillata. Please, Stanford interjected, rising to his feet. Anything to stop this flood of quotes.